Good evening, I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily for Wednesday, January 25th. We begin the newscast with the latest interest rate hike from the Bank of Canada, which it says could be the last one for a while. The central bank confirmed it's raising its key interest rate by 0.25 percentage point to 4.5%. Now, that's the highest it's been since 2007. It also released its latest economic forecast and said it expects inflation to come down significantly this year, reaching about 3% by the middle of the year. If economic developments remain in line with its forecast, the central bank says interest rates will stay put. Well, in another major announcement, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says he will meet with the country's premiers next month in an effort to move healthcare talks along. Mr. Trudeau says he invited the premiers to a meeting in Ottawa on February 7th. He made the announcement this morning on the third and final day of a Liberal cabinet retreat in Hamilton, Ontario. Mr. Trudeau says ongoing negotiations towards a new healthcare funding pact have been front and center throughout the retreat. Meanwhile, Canada has not yet said whether it would follow suit after Germany announced its intentions to send battle tanks to Ukraine. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz made the announcement today. Germany will also approve requests from other countries that want to send German-made Leopard 2 battle tanks to Ukraine to help it in its defense. The Canadian Armed Forces has 112 Leopard 2s in a number of different variations, but Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has declined to say this morning whether Canada will send any of them to Ukraine. Well, amid a rise of violence on public transit, the president of a Canadian transit union wants to convene a national task force. The Amalgamated Transit Union Canada national president says the violent attacks are at what he calls crisis levels. John Danino says the task force should include all levels of government and transit agencies from across the country. The call for a national transit safety task force comes after a string of violent attacks targeted workers and riders on the Toronto Transit Commission. In the past week, police say 2 uniformed TTC workers were assaulted on their way to work. A woman was stabbed on a streetcar, and a TTC driver was shot with a BB gun. All right, turning our attention to a long-standing trade dispute with the United States. Canada's international trade minister says the U.S. appears to be pressing ahead with what she calls unjustified duties on softwood lumber imports. Mary Ng says the anti-dumping and countervailing duties that the U.S. imposes on Canadian softwood lumber are little more than a tax on American consumers. She says Canada will use all avenues to fight the duties. Moving to the West Coast now, where an avalanche survivor is urging people to be cautious this season. This comes as the death toll from snowslides in BC has already reached 5. Ken Wiley was one of 13 people caught in an avalanche north of Revelstoke in January of 2003 that claimed the lives of 7 people. Experts have compared this year's weak snowpack with the 2003 season. Avalanches in Western Canada killed 29 people that season, and most of them were in BC. Alberta's NDP is out with an early election promise. Opposition leader Rachel Notley says if the NDP wins the spring election, it would scrap a COVID-19 review panel led by former Reform Party leader Preston Manning. Ms. Notley says Premier Danielle Smith should focus on helping families struggling with inflation rather than paying Mr. Manning $250,000 for the review. Ms. Smith announced the panel last week, setting the budget at $2 million, with $253,000 of that going to Mr. Manning. All right, moving to the East Coast now, where a Newfoundland and Labrador woman is accused of stealing people's identities to work in long-term care homes. The Royal Newfoundland Constabulary says 43-year-old Lisa Driscoll fraudulently obtained nursing positions in St. John's under several surnames. Ms. Driscoll was arrested on Monday and is facing several charges. Turning our attention to a new report exploring Indigenous identity fraud. The researcher behind the report suggests it would take a psychiatrist to try and fully answer why people do it. The report was written for the University of Saskatchewan by Vancouver-based lawyer Jean Thaye. It explores the harms caused by Indigenous identity fraud while identifying potential red flags and ways to prevent it. Ms. Thaye says she sees the fraud as, quote, the ultimate step in colonialism. A home in Halifax, once owned by Nova Scotia's first Black doctor, has been granted heritage status by Regional Council. Dr. Liguar graduated in 1916 with a medical degree from Queen's University, and he moved to Halifax where he opened a clinic. We'll be right back after a short break. Well, amid growing calls to address what is being referred to as a mental health crisis in Canada, today's medical segment will focus on the connection between your mental health and your physical health. Now, according to the Canadian Mental Health Association, there are multiple correlations between mental health and chronic physical conditions, which can significantly impact a person's quality of life. Now, this in turn could add more strain on our already struggling healthcare system. Well, joining us now to give us more insight into this in our weekly medical segment is Dr. Abhishek Raut, Medical Director at Appletree Medical Group. Dr. Raut, welcome back.
Great to be here, Nima.
Now, we often talk about how diet, drinking, and a lack of exercise can impact your physical health, but how does the way you think impact your body? Just how powerful is this brain-body connection, Dr. Raut?
Well, it's an extremely powerful brain-body connection. What we do know is people living with mental illness will face a range of physical symptoms as a result of the illness, but also as a consequence of treatment as well. So mental illnesses can alter hormonal balances, sleep cycles, and many psychiatric medications have also side effects from weight gain to irregular heart rhythms. So the way people experience their mental illness can really increase their susceptibility for developing poor physical health. Think about the impact of social and cognitive function, giving you decreased energy levels, which can then impact the way you adopt healthy behaviors. People can then lack motivation to take care of their health. They can adopt unhealthy eating and sleeping habits, smoking or substance abuses as well. So what we do know is Canadians on a whole, if you're a Canadian and you report symptoms of depression, you are more than likely to have 3 times as many chronic physical conditions as someone in the general population.
All right, Dr. Raut. And what kind of physical illnesses are directly connected to mental illnesses as well?
Right. So I think it's surprising to people when we see the list of conditions that can affect you when you have a mental health illness. For an example, just using Canadian data alone, what we do know is if you have depression, you're about 1.6 times more likely to get things like diabetes, heart disease, and even 3 times more likely to have a stroke overall. And we see this with other mental health diagnoses as well, much higher percentages of COPD and cancers such as breast, colon, and lung cancer.
Some very concerning information there, Dr. Raut. Now, what about just everyday stress? What sort of impact could that have on your physical health?
Right. So the longer the stress can last, the worse it is really for your mind and body. Chronic stress can cause a lot of changes in your body from things like overeating or bad habits, but also with high demands of a job. The low decision-making latitude is associated with things like increased coronary artery disease, for example. Increased stress also can cause issues such as lack of social support, which again is implicated in a host of mental issues there. Surprisingly, chronic stress can also weaken the immune system, and you can actually have changes in type 1 cytokines, protective T cells in our body, which as we talked about the many cancers above, those deficiencies can actually decrease our ability to fight those tumors or even heal wounds.
Wow, Dr. Raut, lots of interesting information there. Now, something to consider is that advocates are saying we're in a mental health crisis here in Canada, but at the same time, we're experiencing a healthcare staffing shortage. So have you been seeing a rise in patients needing treatment for physical illnesses that are connected to mental health?
Yeah, we're absolutely seeing this rise in physical illnesses, especially those connected with mental health. Many of our patients who have mental health issues are presenting with the significant issues like diabetes and stroke, and not to mention chronic joint pains and chronic fatigue in our healthcare system.
And how do you see this impacting the healthcare system overall?
Well, it's very apparent the system has been under a lot of pressure. Some might argue this pressure has been there far before the pandemic, but to put on top of that, the pandemic, RSV, influenza, long COVID, and now these increased physical illnesses, I think we're playing a difficult game of Jenga right now.
Oh, definitely. Now, a quick 45 seconds left here, Dr. Rao, but what are some simple steps that everyday Canadians can take to better address their mental health?
Right. So I think it's definitely hard to prioritize mental health on a daily basis. And like we discussed, it's incredibly important to do so, though. So taking that time to relax every day, whether it's meditation or yoga, something to do without alcohol and without screens, without looking at your phone, is probably the most practical activity you can do on a daily basis, even if it's for about 10 minutes.
Always helpful advice. Dr. Rao, thank you again for your time today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Stay with us. We'll be right back. And when we return, we're going to be taking a look at mental health and stigma. Toronto Mayor John Tory is calling for a national summit to address what he's calling Canada's mental health crisis. But even with resources, individuals may not want to reach out for help in fear of being labeled. So we're going to take a look at the stigma of mental health in a conversation with Dr. Patrick Corrigan up next. Stay with us. Toronto Mayor John Tory is calling for a national summit to address what he calls Canada's mental health crisis. He's calling on Canada's mayors, ministers, premiers, and the Prime Minister to take part in this summit to discuss how better to support people living with mental health and addictions challenges. Today, January 25th, is also Bell Canada's Let's Talk Day. However, talking about it might not be that easy. According to the Mental Health Commission of Canada, 60% of people with mental health problems or illness won't reach out for help in fear of being labeled. Well, joining us now to talk more about the importance of mental health and overcoming the stigma associated with it is Dr. Patrick Corrigan, a U.S.-based author and mental health advocate. Dr. Corrigan, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you for having me.
Now, the topic of mental health is really coming to the forefront, especially following the pandemic, or at least the height of the pandemic. What have you been hearing from other professionals regarding this shift?
I think everybody's concern about mental health challenges increasing is right on. In some ways, the pandemic was a perfect storm. There was the stress related to it and the sickness and death people experienced. There was the staying in place, being separated from your support network and your mental health providers. Together, it's clear that mental health challenges are increasing throughout Canada.
It is. It's very clear. Now, in terms of your research in particular, we know you look into the stigma associated with mental health. So has the stigma also shifted following the pandemic as mental health is being more talked about?
Well, stigma about anything has gone up a lot through the pandemic. We wrote a paper that suggested that people involved in concerned about COVID were likely to be viewed more negatively. Actually, the social distancing thing, while it was an essential way to deal with the pandemic, it probably made stigma worse because it's sort of the message you need to stay away from these people. When you combine the existing stigma of mental illness is quite significant with this new one. The experiences people had are even worse.
And from your research, what have you found to be the best ways to address this sort of stigma in society, or at least help a patient deal with the stigma?
Well, there's big picture issues and there's small picture issues. The big picture issues is the way to change stigma is really not through education. It's really not going around saying mental illness is a brain disorder. We haven't changed white attitudes about Blacks by going around educating people about it. It's people coming out. It's people telling their stories of recovery. It's learning that, in fact, people can achieve their goals and overcome their symptoms and learn how to live with it quite successfully. And the only person who can do that is a person with lived experience. What does that mean for the individual? I am not necessarily saying your viewers should go out and disclose automatically. I think they should be judicious about it. They may want to find someone who is safe, supportive, hopeful, who you can disclose to and share your story so you're not living with it all by yourself. Of course, mental health providers do that. But on top of that, it's anybody in your support system, your faith-based community you can reach out to.
Talking about it really helps. Now, your work also analyzes the impact of community and personal contact within the recovery of mental illness. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and what that looks like?
Yeah, that, again, what I was just saying, if I might use an analogy, one of the ways we changed attitudes about the LGBTQ movement was not educating people about the fact that they're normal. It's about 20, 30, 40 years ago they came out. And so the brave people doing that really changed the dialogue. So at the community level, the degree to which some people decide to come out at work or come out in their faith-based community or extended family is a way you'll really tear down stigma, because you'll look at them and say, hey, they're a lot like me.
All right, Dr. Corrigan, looks like we've just got about a minute left here, but we mentioned Mayor John Tory is calling for a national summit to address mental illness in Canada. So what are some pillars for officials to consider when implementing this national mental health care plan or strategy?
Two. One is it's all about recovery. It's not all about being sick. The reality is we should be hopeful that people can overcome their mental illness. And the second thing is choice and power lies with the person with the mental health challenge. We don't want to swoop down, grab a bunch of people and cure them. We want to reach out to the community and find out what they think the best way to cure them. And community is a great word for it, because community is a diverse group. And so white people have one approach, people of color have another approach. You have to make sure you involve and encourage all those people to speak up.
All right, Dr. Corrigan, thank you again for your time today on Forum Daily.
Thank you for having me.
All right, stay with us. We'll be right back after the break with more news from around the world. Stay tuned. Ukrainian forces have pulled back from a town in the eastern region of Donbass after a Russian onslaught. An official said the Ukrainian army retreated from the salt mining town of Soledar to preserve the lives of personnel. It's a rare battlefield win for Russia after a series of setbacks in its invasion that started almost a year ago. All right, moving to a war of words between China and the United States in Africa. The Chinese government says the U.S. should stop pressuring it on debt relief for Zambia. Instead, it is urging the U.S. to focus on averting a government default at home with possible repercussions for the global economy. The response comes to remarks by U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen while on a visit to Zambia. She said that it's crucial Zambia address its heavy debt burden with China. The Chinese embassy response highlighted the battle between Republican lawmakers and the Democratic Biden administration over raising the U.S. debt limit to allow more borrowing to keep the government running. To South America now, as thousands of protesters took to the streets of Peru's capital last night. They clashed with security forces who met them with tear gas and pellets. The anti-government protest in Lima was the largest and most violent since last Thursday. This was when large groups of people from remote Andean regions descended on the capital to demand the resignation of the president. Protests have been ongoing for 2 months in Peru, with demonstrators also demanding immediate elections and the dissolution of Congress. All right, switching gears to a new report on African governance, which says much of Africa is less safe and democratic than it was a decade ago. An index compiled by Mo Ibrahim Foundation was released on Wednesday. It found that security and rule of law were on the decline in more than 30 of the continent's 54 countries. The report also notes democratic backsliding, including 8 successful coups in Africa since 2019. British billionaire Mo Ibrahim is using his fortune to promote democracy and political accountability in Africa. In a blow to press freedom, journalist deaths around the world jumped by 50% in 2022. The numbers from the New York-based Committee to Protect Journalists show at least 67 journalists were killed last year. This is the highest number since 2018. The increase is largely driven by the slayings of journalists in Mexico, Haiti, and Ukraine. Meanwhile, a Jewish group that commissioned a survey on Holocaust awareness in the Netherlands says the results show a disturbing lack of awareness. The survey found that 54% of all respondents and 59% of those aged 18 to 39 do not know that 6 million Jews were murdered, and 29% believe that the figure is 2 million or fewer. The survey was commissioned by the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany. Egypt's top religious institution has called on Muslims the world over to boycott Swedish and Dutch products. This is over the desecration of Islam's holy book by far-right activists in the two European countries. Egypt's Al-Azhar, the Sunni Muslim world's foremost religious institution, made the appeal today. The appeal comes following the burning of the Quran by far-right activists. This was during weekend protests in Sweden and the Netherlands. Turning to the tech world now, where Microsoft is reporting some improvement after outages were reported by users around the world earlier today. The problems happened with Microsoft's online services, including the team's messaging platform, the Outlook email system, and other services. The Microsoft 365 Twitter account said that the company is continuing to monitor the recovery. Well, it looks like New Zealand has a new prime minister today. Chris Hipkins was sworn in on Wednesday. His swearing in comes following the unexpected resignation last week of Jacinda Ardern. The 44-year-old Mr. Hipkins has promised a back-to-basics approach, focusing on the economy and inflation. Ms. Ardern announced that she was resigning after 5 years as PM because she no longer had, quote, enough in the tank to do the job justice. New research suggests that practicing mindfulness to relieve anxiety can be just as effective as medication. A study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association Psychiatry tracked people who spent 2 months doing mindfulness-based interventions, which are exercises focusing on controlled breathing and body awareness. Participants reported feeling lower anxiety to the same extent as those prescribed anxiety medication. More research is needed, but doctors say that the study shows mindfulness techniques may be a viable alternative for people who suffer side effects from drugs. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website or follow us on social media. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time on Forum Daily News.